Today we are going to be talking about feeding, maintaining, and baking with your sourdough starter. Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Stephanie from the Farmhouse Mom. I upload every Tuesday and Friday, and today we are going to talk all about your sourdough starter. So thank you so much for everybody who asked questions and commented and watched my how to make a sourdough starter video. That is probably my most popular video, so I figured you would want to hear some questions answered and to see me feed my starter, and then also to hear about how I use my starter throughout the week as I'm baking. And then also, what do you do with your starter if you decide that you're not baking, if you're really busy or you're going on vacation, or just any number of things that might have to pertain to your sourdough starter. Let's go ahead and just feed our starter right now, and then we will start answering questions along the way. So this is my sourdough starter. So if you can see, I hope you can, there's a little bit of clear liquid here on the top. That is called hooch. So this is very runny. You can see how runny it is, not thick at all. It's smelling really strong and really sour, and it is hungry and ready to be fed. So that leads us to one of our questions. What do you do with that hooch liquid on top? Do you pour it out or do you stir it back in? So for me, I always stir it back in. Why do I do that? I like a really strong, acidic, sour taste in my breads, in my baked goods, so I always stir it back in. If you have a ton of hooch, if this thing has been sitting in the refrigerator for 2 months and half of it is the flour and then half of it is hooch and it's got black on top of it, I might consider pouring that off. But you can always stir it in. That's what I always do. I'm a stir in the hooch kind of girl, so you can do whatever you want. If you don't like the sour taste, even this, you can pour it off. I have been baking all week with this. You can see that it is appropriately crusty. So what we are going to do is clean our sourdough starter jar right now. All right, so I'm gonna clean my sourdough starter. So I am just going to take the sourdough starter, I'm gonna dump it in a clean bowl, and I do not wanna waste any of that. So I am going to just get my water, fill it up. I'm gonna rinse around just so I make sure I can get all of that starter out. And then I'm gonna pour this in here. All right, let's clean our jar. I usually do not use soap when I clean my sourdough starter jar, just because, I don't know, I just don't want any like soap residue kind of killing the bacteria. So I have this little scrubby that is made in Poland, and I just use that. You can put this in the washing machine, and it is a really great scrubby. While our sourdough starter jar is in the sink, we are going to grind some fresh flour. And I'll touch a little bit more on the flours. You want to use at least an unbleached all-purpose flour. Fresh ground, fresh milled flour is going to be your most nutritious. I love my NutriMill Harvest. It's really beautiful. I use it all the time. When I was looking at grain mills, that's the one that I wanted, and I felt like it had all of the features that I was going to use for myself personally. There is a wide array of grain mills that you can choose from. You can save an additional $20 off each item that you purchase with my code, TheFarmhouseMom. White hard wheat is going to be closer to an all-purpose flour, and then the red hard wheat is going to be a nice whole wheat flour. I get my wheat berries from Azure Standard, and I will leave a link in the description box so you can visit their website and look at the savings that they offer. All right, so we have our fresh flour that we ground with our NutriMill Harvest. I'll set this over here. We've got our fresh, clean sourdough starter jar. Let's just start with what you have it in. One of my questions, somebody said, is that plastic? No, you don't want to keep your sourdough starter in anything plastic. The sourdough starter is a little bit acidic, and so that viewer mentioned how you wouldn't want the plastic leaching into your sourdough starter. So totally agree with her. You want glass. So I got this beautiful glass vintage container from France for $1 at the thrift store. So that's what I love. It's 1 liter size. I bake for a family of 4. This is a good size. Let's also talk about the lid. So when I have this on the counter, I am just going to put the lid on, and there's a little bit of breathability there, but you don't get bugs. If I were to store this in the refrigerator, let's say I'm going on vacation for 2 weeks, which is laughable because if you have a farm, you never leave. But if I am going to not bake with this for 2 weeks, I'm going to want to get an airtight seal. So I'm going to take one of my little extra jar sealers that I keep on hand, and then I will let this starter have an airtight seal, and I'll put it in the refrigerator, and that's how I will store it if it's in the refrigerator. If I'm storing it on the counter, then I really recommend just try to get yourself this type of little jar. If you're gonna be baking with your sourdough starter, get something that will work for you every day, that's going to be convenient. A towel's going to get moisture, and you might get a little bit of mold on top, and then that's really close to your sourdough starter. So covering it with a tea towel for a couple hours is fine, like with bread, but I think if you're going to bake with your sourdough starter, just get something with glass. I'll leave a link to one that I think would be good. And without the seal, you still are getting a little bit of air, but no bugs. So let's go ahead and feed. This viewer had about 10 questions in one, so it'll be much easier for me just to kind of read it. So the first question was really about feeding the starter and then the amount and the quantity. So let's set that over there. When you feed your starter, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. If you remember, my starter had about half a cup. And so if I have, let's say 1 cup, let's say it was 1 cup of starter, you are going to want to feed it the minimum with a half a cup of water and a half a cup of flour. If you have 2 cups of starter, you're going to want to feed it with a mixture of 2 cups, flour and water. So you are going to at least do 100%. So that's why you don't need to keep a ton of starter on hand. And she also said it was overflowing out of her liter. So you want to use your starter, and you always want to use your starter and be left with just a little bit, maybe 1/4 cup or a half a cup left over to feed. If you have an entire canister full of starter, you need to start baking. A lot of quick recipes, you can just take your favorite recipes that you have, and you can just add a half a cup of sourdough starter to them. So let's say you've got a favorite banana bread or cookie recipe or any pancake or waffle recipe that you have, you can just add some starter to it. You can't swing a dead cat on the internet without hitting a sourdough starter recipe. My favorite pancake recipe is Farmhouse on Boone. I feel like everybody uses that one. It is totally legendary. Lisa from Farmhouse on Boone pancake recipe. If you have a ton of starter, start baking. Make some pancakes for your family, make some biscuits, make some pizza dough. For me, I have a pizza dough recipe that I have baked with for years, and when I have a ton of sourdough starter, I will use that pizza dough recipe and use up a cup or 2 of sourdough starter. All right, let's go ahead and feed our sourdough starter. So I'm gonna have 2 starters right now just to show you the difference between a fresh ground whole wheat and then also some bread flour. All right, so we have our sourdough starter, we have our water because we've already mixed it up, and now we are going to feed our starter. And as you notice, I'm not measuring. This looks like a nice thick pancake batter, so that is good for me. And then I'm gonna be doing a lot of baking today, which is why I don't mind making up a bunch of starter. So here is my whole wheat, fresh ground flour. I used a lot less flour on the bread flour. I used a whole cup. On this, I only used 2 scoops of this 1/4 cup. You can see how much more water this whole wheat absorbs. So it's a little thick, but it's good for me because I'm gonna be using it for baking. I'll just let that absorb, and then if I come and I feel like it's really, really pasty, I might add more water. So we have our sourdough starter fed, and we're planning on baking this afternoon, but let's say things get busy and we don't bake. What I would do, let's say this is nice and bubbly, what I would do is I would just stick it in the refrigerator and put it in there for just a few days until I am ready to bake. It will, you know, kind of put itself on pause, kind of a freeze frame, and this will stay nice and healthy. All you'll have to do is pull the sourdough starter out of the fridge, let's say in a week or so, let it warm up, kind of like you don't like to, you know, just get right out of bed cold. Let it warm up to room temperature for just an hour or 2, and then you can feed it and it will just start bubbling and it'll be good for you. Let's talk about what we're gonna do when we do bake. So this is going to be nice and bubbly. It's gonna be at its peak. Let's say I need to make some sourdough bread. I'm gonna make my sourdough bread. It's going to be almost empty. I'm gonna feed it and I'm gonna start the whole process over again. I typically use my sourdough starter every day. And I know that sounds like a lot. I use it to thicken gravy. If I have nothing prepared for dinner, I will make like a little skillet. We had that last week. I had a bunch of chicken. I had some frozen Brussels sprouts. I just fried it in a cast iron skillet and I made some sourdough biscuits, put it on top and baked it. It's just really versatile, and to me, if I have sourdough starter on hand, whether it's fed or whether it's hungry, I can make something. I can make a pizza dough, add a little yeast if I need to, whatever I need to make. Sourdough starter is on the menu for dinner. It's really, really versatile. Another question was, I don't bake every day. How long does it take for the starter to get strong? Do you keep it in the refrigerator? When do you put it in the refrigerator? So I think I answered that. If you have tried and you have not been successful with it, I would probably start out by making biscuits, by making pizza, banana bread. Just start making those things, and your sourdough starter, the more you feed it, the stronger it gets. So if you have made a loaf, it did not turn out, just give your starter a little bit of time. Sometimes people say it takes a couple weeks or a month for it to be strong enough to make bread with, but it definitely, the more you feed it, the stronger it will be. So if you have had a complete failure, I made quite a few bread bricks before I got a really nice loaf. If you just have a complete failure, then just hold off and give yourself another couple weeks to make some bread. Just make your pizza, your biscuits, your pancakes. I don't have 10 kids, I just have 2, so family of 4 is, you know, a pretty small family, and I still find occasion to bake with it every day. So I had a question about the water as well. Is it room temperature? Is it cold? We have well water, so I just use the water right out of the tap. Room temperature is probably best because it's a warmer water and your starter doesn't have to struggle as much, especially in the wintertime, to get nice and warm and active. Don't feed your starter hot water because you will kill all of the yeast. I also had a question about adding commercial yeast to start a starter. So you can put yeast in your starter. It's probably more of like a pre-fermented bread. That's probably what that would be classified under. But if you wanted to start your starter with commercial yeast, and if you fed it over like a week or so, most of the commercial yeast will kind of fade away, and then the wild yeast will overtake it, and it will become populated mostly by wild yeast. So that is something that you can do, but commercial yeasts tend to be really, really strong. And so to me, it's just easier to just start it with some bread and water, keep it warm, and get your sourdough starter going with the wild yeasts that are in your environment. But you certainly could do that if you wanted to, and if you felt like, this viewer mentioned that it was in an older cookbook. So if you felt like doing that experiment and you wanted to do it that way, then I feel like that's a valid way to get it going. If you want to try it that way, you can. Another question that somebody asked me was, when do you want to bake bread with your starter? At what point do you want it strong and bubbly? Yes, you want your starter strong and bubbly when it is time to make bread, because it's at its peak of fermentation and it is going to give you a really nice loaf. However, I often bake bread with starter that is not active and bubbly, just because my starter is 4 years old and it is really strong. And like I said, I feed it every day. I feed it almost every day. So it is really strong. And so I can make a bread with just inactive, hungry starter. I wouldn't recommend doing that when you just are starting with your starter. Another question that I had was, when making the sourdough starter, several people said, why isn't my starter rising? It's just flat and it's just nothing's happening. So what I would do is I'd give it a little bit more time. So keep feeding it, keep discarding it. So the reason that we're discarding, which I hope I explained in my sourdough starter video, the reason that we're discarding is if you have a very large amount of starter to feed, it's going to require a very large amount of flour. That's going to be really costly, and you will never use up all of that starter. So that's why we're discarding when we're first making it. We're discarding down to a very small amount, giving it food, and so that then it has time to grow. So if you found by on day 5 or 6 that your starter is still not getting really bubbly, I would put it in a warmer spot, and then I would just keep going. It might be day 8, maybe your house is really cold, or maybe your flour that you got from the store, maybe it's a little older. There's a lot of reasons why it could not be rising, but I would just keep going until you get some bubbles. Any sort of recipe that I am making, you can add a little bit of sourdough. It will give you a nice tangy taste. It's nice and healthy with its prebiotics and probiotics, and it just gives a wonderful flavor profile. I'm working to get all of my recipes on thefarmhousemom.com. I'm wanting to add at least one a week so it can be there for you. Thank you so much for stopping by the farm today, and I can't wait to see you Friday.